Hello everyone, welcome back to an episode of Incorrect Politics. Today we're going to discuss how the polling media will bias towards the Democrats and how you can interpret the polling result in future elections starting from 2024. So first, on your screen you might see that there is a little map over there. Well, there isn't some kind of tornado going on inside the nationwide that changed the entire electoral map overnight. It's just I'm trying to portray you how exactly is the media biased towards each state. So on this map, a red state denotes that Donald Trump underperformed the polls. For example, in the state of Illinois, the polls are predict him to lose by around 15 points, but he ended up losing by more than 16 points. That is an underperformance. But for the blue ones, that means that Donald Trump outperformed the pollsters. For example, in the state of Montana, the polls had him up by around 8 to 9 points, but it ended up carrying the state by around 16 to 17 points. That's a big difference. So by this map, we can immediately see that there is a very heavy bias towards the Republicans because 433 of the electoral votes were favoring the Democrats in terms of the pollsters, and only 50 favors the Republicans. And that's a very big difference. And if we take a closer look at how the different votes were distributed, we will see some very interesting patterns. So we can start from those safe blue states. So it's like state of Montana, Idaho, Utah, North Dakota, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Kentucky, and West Virginia. What do these states have in common? Well, it's quite simple. All of these states are actually deep red states in terms of the 2020 electoral votes. So if we try to look at some of the states, for example, the state of North Dakota, we can see that, well, on this graph, we can see there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 data points from March to November is being conducted in North Dakota. And most of these polls were by D- pollsters, SurveyMonkey. Yeah, basically almost all of them. So these SurveyMonkeys are not a very reliable source in terms of pollings, and obviously that reflects that. So these Republican states were I can say that they will completely be misdone in terms of the polling. Well, but people might say that there isn't too much a difference between a 20-point victory and a 13-point victory for the Democrats or Republicans, right? So it's very normal for the firms to not focusing on these states. Even though that is the case, but why exactly isn't a pollster? Yes, we can maybe tolerate a 13 points errors, but why is all the points of error being targeted towards Republicans? Why isn't there like maybe a 20-point bias for maybe Democrats inside the states like Rhode Island or Connecticut? But instead, even in these states, the polls were still favoring the Democrats. We cannot explain that. Anyways, that actually shows you that the pollster itself has a very serious house effect. Well, now that we can start to move into some different group of states and we can see some more interesting phenomenon. So let's start of the battleground states. Those states, let's start with the Rust Belt state maybe, Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. These three states, most of them are in the likely column. And what does likely column denotes? In my graph, that means that there's an over 5-point difference between the pollster and the actual result. Well, certainly 5 points isn't that catastrophe, but it's still a very big difference in terms of the polling. Because if you give 5 points to Trump away from Biden, he would have won Minnesota. And he would have won a lot of states. He could come close to a tilt margin in Virginia. He could safely handily won Georgia and Arizona with that 5-point boost. He could have flipped Nevada. He could have flipped the entire election if you give him 5 points in any given state. So 5 points is not a small number. And look at it, Iowa is also a battleground state. And this time it was being off by more than 5 points. Nevada is a battleground state. It was off by 3 to 5 points. That's a lot of different points, but they were all favoring the Democrats. We can see that these battleground states, you couldn't claim that they're as these kind of deep red states where people don't care about 20 points or 30 points. These battleground states, we care about every inch of the point. We care about 1 point difference, 2 point difference, and the pollster knows that. They put a lot of money inside these states, try to make their polls inside these states as accurate as possible. Yet they still make a 5-point margin of error, and they were all biased towards the same direction. It's a systematic error, and it should be easily fixable if it's a systematic difference one. But they couldn't fix it from 2016, 2012, and beyond. They still couldn't fix it. In fact, if you look at the past election map, this 2020 map is a reverse of my map, but basically what's blue on my map is red on theirs, and what's red on their map is blue on theirs. So the red one denotes where Trump outperformed the polls. For example, in Indiana, Trump outperformed the polls by 5.2 percentage point. So by this graph, we can see that in 2020, 485 votes were favoring the Democrats in terms of the poll, and only 53 actually did better for Trump. So in 2016, what was the number? 451. So we can even argue that in 2020, the poll difference was much more serious. So that's 2016, 451 difference. 2012, Mitt Romney, that's still 413 towards the Republican. So you can't even say that Trump himself is a people who has a lot of disputable points, because Mitt Romney, a liberal candidate, completely different from Donald Trump, he still faces a very heavy bias in terms of polling. 2008 McCain, well, a family man, an army guy, is he better? No, it's still a 323 towards Republican. Well, certainly it looks much better out there because there's a lot of blue states in the middle of America, but still, it's still being biased towards the Democrats. In 2004, Bush, 498. In 2000, 463. Whether it's a close election, a landslide election, it's always favoring the Democrats. Now let's see if that's an exclusive sign is special for the 21st century, and we can see it's no. In 96, Clinton versus the Republican nominee Bob Dole. Well, it's the closest one you have ever seen this entire timeline, but it's still favoring Democrat by a very narrow margin. In 1992, 357 for George H.W. Bush. In 1988, 461 against Bush. In 84, Ronald Reagan, 525. Well, that's exactly the same amount of electoral votes Ronald Reagan won in 1984 election, because he carried the state of Minnesota and District of Columbia. Well, on this map, he had Nebraska, Arkansas, and West Virginia, but this Nebraska is only the 3rd district. So in 1980, that's 448 against Ronald Reagan. 1976, still 311 votes against Republican nominee. So you can see that this poll difference against Republican isn't a thing of this century. It's not even for this few election cycle. It's a persistent problem since 1966. Yet no one seems to have a good way to solve it. Even though we can already see that this is a systematic differences, no one could still solve it. So if we actually think about it, that's a very fun fact, right? But there is some certain different regions where we must take a different approach. So after my video until this point, you might think that, well, if I see Ohio is around neck and neck, we can assume that Republican is leading this state. If we do see that Michigan is, let's say, 1 point toward Democratic, I would say that Michigan is slightly ahead for Republicans. But the same thing doesn't apply to each corner of the region, and that's the very heavy headache part, because if every state were biased towards the Democrat by 3 points, then that would be much easier. But some places the bias were not as heavy, and those are the places where I mark as a tilt. That includes the state of Georgia, the state of Arizona. These two states, or the Sun Belt state, have found one thing in common. These places are the places where Republicans were losing ground. So what does losing ground mean? It basically means that in the past, Republicans used to have control of these states, but gradually they were losing the status of a red state. So that's actually interesting. I basically think that this interprets that the polling company, they have a formula to adjust after they have a raw data. So let's say if they see that maybe Hillary Clinton was up by only 2 points in Michigan, based on the experience they have from the Obama election, they would have think that, well, Hillary Clinton wouldn't only be up by 2 points in Michigan. Let's adjust an extra 5 points for them in the state of Michigan. So now it becomes a 7-point victory from Hillary Clinton in Michigan. Whereas in Arizona, if they see that Hillary Clinton is up by 1 point in Arizona, they would have think that, oh no, it's a Donald Trump, it's supposed to be a Republican state. Even though we do see some more diversity, demographics being shifting in, Arizona wouldn't have been so Democratic. So maybe they will keep that 1 point result, and they wouldn't add an extra 5 point Democrats to the result. So that basically tells us that this reason why Arizona and Georgia, they were only tilt. In fact, it was only a 1.5 point difference between Georgia's poll and its actual result. While it's still systematically biased towards the Democrat, it tells us that the formula being used inside these states might actually be more accurate than the ones that were used by the so-called consensus, because this was the consensus map of 2020. By this standard, Ohio is supposed to be decided by 1 or 2 points nail biter, similar to the ones of the margin inside Wisconsin. But no, Ohio was decided by more than 8 points. Florida was decided by more than 3.5 points. It was decided more than Wisconsin went to Joe Biden, more than Arizona and Georgia went to Joe Biden. Yet all of these states have the same color, or even a different kind of color that is biased towards the opposite direction. So after you watch this video, from now on you will have a more general idea and better idea on how to interpret the polling result released by the different news media outlets. I hope you learned something today, and I wish you good luck. If you do like this video, please like, share and subscribe. You can comment down below to tell me your thoughts, and I'm signing out today.